present a joint paper with my colleague Alina Esteves, who is here, and also Jennifer McGarrigle, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us. And I must admit that the results we are going to present are really very preliminary analysis of some TIMI's data we have collected into Brazilian regions. Well, following the previous presentations in our paper, which is about migration decision making, we try to privilege the migrant's perspective at the very micro level, and we build upon the conceptual framework centered on the notions of aspirations and capability, how were developed by our TIMI's colleagues, Haas and Jorgen Carling, who is here. So we will explore the reasons why some people move and have migrant aspirations and others not into different contexts in Brazil. So Brazil is a very big and very diverse country. So we will present some preliminary results of this survey to understand how migrant aspirations developed into different contexts, and also have a look at the different opportunities to migrate in these two different contexts. So, starting from this diagram, which guided us in the THEMIS project, we've tried to link, to analyze the interactions between structural conditions and migration, linking macro and micro factors, and in this paper we, as I've mentioned, you are looking at the micro level, so at the individuals' perspectives. Conceiving, as I've mentioned, the migration process is a conjugation of the desire to migrate and the capacity to migrate. The notion of access to migration and mobility in general is really very important, and incorporates the differences in opportunities, so inequalities of access to resources needed to migrate and have an influence on the development of migrant aspirations. So we have conducted a survey in Brazil, which includes 425 residents aged with 18 and more in two different regions. One in Campinas, which is located in the estado de São Paulo, one of the richest areas in Brazil, and Governador Valadares, small medium city in the estado de Minas Gerais, more peripheral area, and Mantena in the same micro region, Val do Rio Doce, which in fact are completely different, given the economic structure, the migration traditions, the level of incomes, the location in the context of Brazil, and so on. So the target population that we surveyed was the resident population, the whole population aged with 18 and more, and the sampling method we have used is a cluster sampling method. So we have selected randomly some census tracts in both the areas we have analyzed, and then in each of one we also followed a random procedure. So here are the locations of the research areas in Brazil. Those two very close in the same, well, what's this? I don't know how this works. In the same micro region in Minas Gerais, and Campinas in São Paulo. It's 1.5 hours from the city of São Paulo. Well, just some background information on the two regions. In comparison with state level, Minas Gerais Val do Rio Doce includes the two small areas in Minas Gerais, the state of São Paulo and the city of Campinas and Brazil. Looking at the population growth rate, of course, Campinas is growing very fast, much more than Val do Rio Doce. Immigration rate, you can see the big difference between Val do Rio Doce and Campinas. The main destination, by the way, of the migrants of this region was the United States. More recently developed a new flow to Europe and particularly to Portugal immediately when it became much more difficult to enter into the United States. So the main destination, United States, secondly, Portugal and Spain. These are results of the Brazil census data, Brazil census in 2010. And regarding the income differences, you can see the big gap between both study areas. Val do Rio Doce, 27, almost 28% of the private dwellings have less than one minimum wage a month, while in Campinas less than 10%. So you can see the big differences, and if we look at education level, we only have here the illiteracy rate, and of course you can see clearly the differences. Well, so how have you analyzed the development of aspirations? So the dependent variable we have in our questionnaire is formulated in the following way. Ideally, if you had the opportunity, would you like to go abroad to live or work sometime during the next 5 years, or would you prefer to stay? So it's our dependent variable and the way we have formulated it in our questionnaire. And regarding the capabilities to migrate, of course, we have interviewed some people who have already had a migratory experience, but of course this doesn't capture what we really would like to analyze. So the question we have used from our survey to represent in a way the capacity, the access to migrate is the following. Have you taken any action to prepare a move abroad? And we have another one asking them about their perception of really possibility to migrate. So, using a logistic regression analysis, we try to identify the best predictors of the development of aspiration to migrate. So, if we look at the responses of this question, ideally, if you had the opportunity, would you like to go abroad to live or to work during some time the next 5 years? Well, in the total survey, around 1/3 really had the aspiration to migrate. But there are differences, statistical significant differences among the two regions. Val do Rio Doce, so the two small areas in Minas Gerais, and Campinas. The aspiration to migrate is much higher in Campinas, in a more central region, more developed and so on, than in Governador Valadares and Mantena, despite the fact that the immigration rate is higher in the case of Minas Gerais, much higher than in the case of Mantena. Well, regarding destination country, the first choice, because of course when we look to the access to migrate to the first choice, there are of course differences and different constraints among the potential migrants. Well, let's go fast and look at the results of binary logistic regression with significant variables influencing the migration aspiration. measured by the question I've already mentioned. Well, of course, we've controlled from the region of residence, since they represent completely different contexts. So I'm a geographer, and of course I totally agree with the comments made this morning by Professor Ronald Scotland. And in fact, there are significant differences in the level of migrant aspirations between the regions. Considering Campinas, the more developed area, the big city, as a reference category, in fact, the probability to have to aspire to migrate is less in the other two areas. But the most important predictor, as you can see, is age. Because it's the people aged 18 to 25 and 26 to 35, in fact, have more aspiration to migrate, and it decreases in the other age groups. The other variables who are in fact very important predictors are the representations, the migratory the representations of Western Europe, which is here, and we have measured the representations of Western Europe, building an index using the responses of statements like this one. In Europe, there are good job opportunities. In Europe, there are equal access to health for everybody, and so on. So based on these statements, the answers they could give, they should choose between agree or disagree. So we have built an index of representations of Western Europe, considering the positive evaluations. So you can see how important this is in the development of migrant aspirations. Okay. The other one is the frequency of communication with people in Western Europe. So we have different possibilities: never contact almost every day, every week, and so on. So based on this, and this is also positive influence on the development of migrant aspirations. So, of course, this is important, the role of networks, contacts, and so on, interactions. But the interesting thing and the result is that the migratory experience of family members doesn't have this impact, which is interesting. It's not enough to have family members with a migratory experience or still are living abroad. What really matters is the frequency of contact with people living abroad in other European countries. Another variable who is also significant is the unsuccessful attempt to migrate. And having had an attempt to migrate which was unsuccessful decreases the aspiration to migrate. Of course, we have here age, and we can understand the importance in an indirectly way how aspirations change along the life course, but of course it's based only on a specific moment, the moment of the survey. Well, if we look at the gap between aspirations and capability to migrate, because only 23% of those who told us they aspire to migrate believe that they in fact have the possibility to go abroad, to live or to work. And we use 2 questions of our questionnaire. And you can see that only 72% of respondents believe that it's almost certain, so they have access to migration, and 40.5 responded that it's likely they move abroad, and around 40% responded not likely at all. So in fact, this represented different access, the vision they have, they can in fact migrate. Have you undertaken any action to prepare a move abroad? So 23% said no. But the interesting thing is, in the case of Minas Gerais, the more peripheral area, more respondents have had attempts to migrate. We've also tried, in order to understand the gap between migrant aspirations and the capability to migrate using only these variables, we've tried another logistic regression analysis, and including several kinds of variables, I mean individual variables like gender, education, I don't have the time to enumerate all of them, but the result is that we found out that only education had a significant influence to explain this gap between migrant aspirations and the capability to migrate. We can see it very clearly here when we compare the responses in accordance, no or yes, in accordance to different education levels. Those who have postgraduate tertiary education or undergraduate tertiary education, the percentage of yes is higher than in the previous classes. Well, trying to understand the steps they have undertaken to move abroad, it's also interesting to find out, of course, contact people known in that country for assistance, more than 43%, but immediately after came collect information from media on the internet. So this explains a bit the importance of education is in accordance with the previous result, and looking at these actions, potential migrants, the ones who have migrant aspirations developed, illustrates clearly the importance of that social media can have in shaping migration patterns in the future. Well, I must conclude. Our empirical analysis, and I must emphasize that these are only preliminary results of the analysis of the data we have collected. We also have a lot of qualitative data that we didn't have yet the time to go through in detail. But our empirical analysis in these 2 research areas allowed us to identify a number of elements that increase or decrease the aspirations to migrate. At the individual level, of course, age, young people have more aspirations to migrate. The representations of destinations, once again, at the individual level, but of course, this is the outcome of the context in which they live, the context they have, the macro structure. So these individual representations, in fact, must seen in a much broader context. Social networks, of course, was one of the most important predictors, but the frequency of contact is the key. It's not enough to have family or friends abroad. And geographical context of origin giving the significant differences between the 2 research areas under analysis. Thank you very much.